My name's Shakti. I'm the writer of Counting and Cracking. About 10 years ago, I had a real hunger to find out more about my family history. And at that stage, I didn't know that Counting and Cracking would be what would eventuate. But I knew more about the rise of Hitler in Weimar Germany than I knew about what happened in Sri Lanka or why my family left. I interviewed a lot of people, from people in my family to people who are politicians or people who came here as refugees, and the information I learnt from that really changed what I thought I was doing. It was less about trying to find out my family history per se, and feeling that I'm sure a lot of migrants have, that there is this epic backdrop to how they got here and why they're here that only ever gets delivered to them in drip feed. You can close your eyes to it, but if you decide to be aware of it, then you have to confront the fact that you don't really know who you are because you don't know how you got here. I felt like I couldn't go forward properly without understanding all of that. And I knew that because it was a Sri Lankan story, that the personal and the political weren't separated, that having to unlock the different versions of truths that my family would occasionally just drop every now and then meant having to unlock also the different versions of the political truth of Sri Lanka's history. So they weren't separate, if that makes sense. They're kind of hopelessly intertwined, and we can't figure out one without figuring out the other.
My name is Eamon Flack and I'm the director of Counting and Cracking.
How did the two of us meet, Eamon?
We met at Carriageworks because you were doing a showing of an early draft when you were a resident artist at Carriageworks.
I remember you being very polite.
Was I?
Well, because we had to bump out the showing and you were just waiting outside.
Ah.
Yeah.
I remember meeting your mum actually, more than I remember meeting you.
You're not the only person who said that to me before.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I started writing Counting and Cracking, I told my mum about it. She said it was a really stupid idea. And at the beginning of my journey of writing it, very little of it was autobiographical. My mother didn't talk about Sri Lanka when she came to Australia, and growing up I didn't hear anything about it. And I know now that she'd really closed her heart to the country. But at the time it was just a silence. But what happened during the course of developing the play is that my mother would quietly and alone read drafts. She came to showings and came to developments, and it gave her a safe space to start thinking about her relationship with her homeland again, and it gave her an opportunity to understand what I was doing. And over the last few years especially, she's really started opening up about Sri Lanka, and she's really started reconciling with her homeland, which is an incredible thing for the play to have achieved already. I'm hoping it can have a similar effect on people in our audience. But it also meant that a lot of her perspective has started to seep into the latest drafts of the work. And so weirdly, it's becoming more and more, if not autobiographical, family biographical. But that's only because of the power of the play itself, if that makes sense, and the kinds of things theatre can do in terms of the journeys it can take people on.
We've done workshops of the play where your mum and other people have said things for the first time that they've never talked about before, and that those things have gone into the play.
What's been amazing about the way that the play has been shaped is that Eamon and I have always talked about how can we make something that speaks to multiple audiences at once. And it's really tricky, every single line in the play has to make sense and be real to the Sri Lankan audience at the same time as to a wider audience. And I didn't understand the power this work had as an Australian story, as a migrant story, and as a kind of universal story about how the big systems of politics and economics affect the little things in our lives. really until the last few years, because I was so kind of laden with the responsibility I felt towards my own community. And it's really been amazing seeing what the play has meant to all sorts of people from all walks of life who aren't connected to and not concerned with the minutiae of Sri Lankan history, but it speaks so deeply to them about their feelings of land and belonging and migration. You know, Hazem Shamas, he's one of the cast members of Canning and Cracking, and his mum came as a refugee to Australia, and he was like, this is my mum's story. And so that kind of stuff makes me really excited about what the play means to a wider audience, and that's been a real surprise to me. For me, the story of this play is about our interdependence. In terms of the actual narrative of the play, Sri Lanka's future lies in us being able to find ways to reconcile, and our diaspora's future lies in us being able to find ways to reconcile. And I remember there was a dramaturgical moment when it seems reductive now, but it's kind of like we kind of went, this play's about whether people can live together or not. Like, can they do it, And so for me, it's very fitting that the only way that behind the scenes this story can ever reach audiences is also because we have to accept that we're interdependent. Belvoir can't do this play on its own. Kokiris can't do this play on its own. And if we can't depend and rely on each other, then we can't tell stories like this either.
Yeah. When we started on it was kind of like about as big as anything we'd done, and then it got bigger.
Get bigger.
Yeah. There's been something about plunging into this accidental 5-year relationship of kind of complete trust, though, and there's something very, very beautiful and very rich about being able to just take a breath and sit in a situation that I don't understand in order to make something that we're doing together possible. And that's kind of what the play's about.
This thing happens when you are talking to your community, which is that you take in your predetermined view of what they're like. And that predetermined view is not shaped by the community. It's shaped by how the media talks about them. It's shaped by how history books talk about them. It's shaped by how political leaders talk about them. Going into and talking to the community, a much more complex and sophisticated picture emerged of who we were. For example, we're taught, a lot of us, to believe that the civil war happened in Sri Lanka because of a divide along ethnic lines, and that was a deep division in our society. But when you start talking to people, whether they're from Colombo, which is our major city, or Batticaloa, which is like a regional town, you see that so much of Sri Lanka has Tamil and Sinhalese and Burgher and Muslim and Buddhist and Hindu all wrapping in and around each other. And you find that there are pockets of Colombo where people who are political enemies, outside of Parliament, they'd be having a whiskey together at night as friends. And their lives would be far more separate from a villager in regional Sri Lanka or up in Jaffna or Farmer than supposed ethnic or racial divides. And you started to get this picture of how the systems at play in a society over time can chip away at our best instincts and build systems that force people to think as separate from each other, as divided from each other. And I started to see how a very vibrant, beautiful country with so much going for it was just chipped away at until violence became normal. I can see how that chipping away is happening in our Western democracies as well. And in Australia, I can see how that creates the kind of heartbreak for someone like my mother, who would then find it unable to talk about how that happened to the place she used to love and why there's a silence for the next generation. And all of that is a much more interesting and real story than the story we're told by our history books and our media and our political leaders. And that became the task of Canning and Cracking, how to tell that story.
And in the time that this play has been written, the issues it deals with about immigration, but also about politics of populism and divisiveness, have sadly kind of increasingly begun to match the reality that the play describes tragically. What happened in Sri Lanka is now happening all over the world. As we've worked on it, the strange feeling of history repeating, perhaps unpleasantly, and of how we might avoid that future has been quite strong, actually.